Well, hello, and thank you for joining us for the second edition of Deep Dive. My name is John, and I have the pleasure of sitting across the table with Pastor Shawn, who is the lead pastor of Family Worship Center in Lakeland, Florida. And our goal for this conversation today is to hopefully start more conversations in your small groups, your relationships, and your everyday life. And ultimately, we just want to become better disciples of Jesus. And so hopefully this conversation will help us do that today. So we'll be taking some key points from Pastor Shawn's Sunday message, and we'll be kind of expounding on them a bit more through this conversation. So your Sunday message was centered around this event in Mark chapter 5.
Right.
And Jesus encounters a ruler from the synagogue, Jairus, who I never in my whole life have heard it pronounced Jairus. I've always heard it pronounced Jairus, so that was a cool twist.
We don't know which one's right.
Okay.
One day somebody will tell us.
I was assuming that I knew the wrong one, so you can get away with telling me that that's the right one. So his daughter was very sick and close to death, and he invites Jesus to his house to pray for her. Then a whole series of events unfolds. Now, you uncover a lot of things in this message, so I suggest that if you guys haven't listened to it, you go listen to the whole message. But for the sake of our conversation, we're just going to discuss a few of those thoughts. So you mentioned that, like some people around Jairus, that there are some people in our circle who try to deplete our faith, and that not everyone celebrates faith. And so you mentioned how, like in 2 Corinthians 6:14, we're told not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers or to fellowship with darkness. And so I'm glad you kind of broke this down, because you mentioned that it doesn't necessarily mean we can't have unbelieving friends.
Sure.
But it does mean that there's a level of partnership that we should only have with Christians.
Yeah.
And so depending on the person, I know for me, I have a wide range of relationships in my life. Some of them are deep. Some of them are more shallow. Family, people I work with, people I used to work with. And so there's a whole wide variety of people that I hang out with, or maybe on a regular basis, or every once in a while, you get that text, hey, let's grab dinner.
Yeah.
So if we were to audit our relationships and the relationships around us, how do we even begin to determine who we let speak into our lives, who we spend time with, and then who do we move out of our circle, our core circle, because it feels like sometimes it can be a little bit messy, and it can be confusing as to, okay, well, should I kind of let this person go? Should I be this close to that person? So how would how should we do that as Christians, audit kind of our relationships?
Yeah. I'm sure there are many varied ways to do this, but for me, it is it has been more from a visionary perspective, meaning what am I trying to accomplish in my life right now? So let's just ignore believer, unbeliever for a minute and just speak to station of life. If I am a new parent, I would feel like I need parents in my life, people who are both, they've already done it, but then people who are doing it now with me. Right. And they might have a 1-year-old and I have a newborn. Those people can speak into my life in such ways that helps me do what I'm doing. So there's that. In order to spend more time with somebody who I have not spent more time with, so if I'm bringing a new parent into my life because I'm a new parent, that means there's somebody I'm going to spend less time with. I just feel like it's just natural. Like we said, love may multiply, but time doesn't. And so now I'm having to say who in my life is going to actually not help me be a better parent.
Right.
So if my friend who I shoot a lot of pool with or I play a lot of golf with, now I can't do that as much because I now am parenting, I have to just naturally let time with that friend slide. I think it's very organic. And then it allows me time to pick up and bring somebody in. But if we're talking about like we'll go to the Psalms. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, who stands in the way of sinners, who sits in the seat of the scornful. Now we see people who are scornful. We see sinfulness, wickedness. These are things that now I need to sort of push away from my life. And I think that's really hard for people in general, but new Christians specifically, because their entire life has been with people who believe like they believe. Now they believe differently. And so what does that mean? For them to be a better, and I know we don't like this phrase, but for the sake of conversation, for them to be a better Christian, they have to spend more time with Christians.
Right.
In order to do that, they have to spend less time with people who don't believe like they do. And I think it's a bit of a hierarchy. It's like, well, who's the person who hurts me the most? And by hurt, I mean, who's the person that I do the most dumb things with that I don't need to do anymore? That's the person I'm going to begin separating from, because our relationship is based on a behavior or a habit that I don't want to do anymore. And so it's easy to kind of find reformation from the habit if I distance myself from the person. There is trauma that happens there because, they feel like you think you're better than me and now you're not hanging out with me anymore. And there is a lot of that emotionalism to kind of work through. Yeah. But yeah, long winding answer, but I think it would be based on just who is keeping me from following God the most, and index those persons into a space that I'm aware of it and I'm intentionally spending less time with them. Right. So maybe I might text them more and talk to them on the phone less because I can control that conversation better. Or I'm going to talk more on the phone and go to dinner less because I can control that conversation a little better. But it's just learning to minimize time, not pushing somebody away because I want to keep them in my circle. Right. I just don't want them at the closest layer of my circle.
Right.
So
because you could still have a positive impact on their life if you completely cut them out.
Absolutely.
Then, you might need to completely cut them out depending on the situation, but you also realize that, if you're their only point of reference to Jesus and, to the church, then you might still want to have some kind of relationship with them.
Yeah, and even to that point, John, when you bring in your gospel conversation, sometimes the person themselves, they self-select. So if now when we're together, we used to do activity A, and now we're doing activity B, and I'm talking more about my faith, that may not be enjoyable to that person. Right. And so they themselves sort of limit the interaction. Mm-hmm. So I think when you are being the person God's called you to be, sometimes that alone will create the separation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's good. So we kind of have to take the initiative to maybe bring our faith into the conversation where if it's being controlled by maybe somebody that is, has a more worldly lifestyle, they're, whether it's scornfulness or wickedness, whatever it is, in those moments, bring forth, our faith, talk about Jesus, and then in that way, that in itself, we might not even have to say anything difficult.
Sure.
It might bring that you said organically.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. Cool. So you talked about fear in your message, and which is probably one of the greatest issues right now in our world, in our country. There's a lot of things to be afraid of. Yeah. Jesus had to sort of recenter Jairus from the fear that was being sown by the crowd around them while they were on his way to his house. And so I thought what you said was really helpful. You said when we emphasize the problem, it results in fear. Yeah. But when we simply have an awareness of the problem, that it results in wisdom. Yeah. So what would be a good warning sign for us to be aware that we might be living, leading, or parenting from a place of fear rather than wisdom and awareness? Is there clear indicators that we can watch for? And then have you caught yourself maybe ever living or leading from a place of fear before?
Absolutely. Yeah, so let's just talk parenting for a minute. There are gospel conditions to parenting, so where it talks about teaching your child in a way or giving discipline to your child. How a child is disciplined is very much disputed, and rather talk about what's disputed, let's just hone in on, am I giving discipline to my child? Right. Does my child actually know when they have done something that is not best for them? Have I made that very, very clear? In discipline, there are boundaries. I mean, if somebody is a timeout type parent and they take their child from an interaction and they put them in a timeout scenario, if they leave them in that timeout scenario for too long, that can enter into a place of abandonment. So timeout might be fine, abandonment may not be. But if now I'm afraid to do timeout at all because I'm afraid that my child is going to feel distance from me, now I'm not looking at it as, I know discipline is right, I know this is an effective means, so it's visionary. I'm disciplining my child so that they will live a life best for them. Now it's, I'm not going to give discipline because I'm afraid of what might happen. And I think we see that especially with toddlers because they're very hard to manage, and we see that with teenagers because they're very hard to manage. So I can say as a parent of a toddler, I had to wrestle with that. I wrestle with it more as a parent of a teenager. We want our kids to have good things, right? And just take something like shoes. We're about to step into the school season. Shoes are a big deal. Usually parents can only afford so much. And again, walking away from the conversations about prayer and just believing God for that amazing pair of shoes, let's just deal with budgets. And you might be able to afford an $80 pair of shoes, which to me still sounds like a lot of money for shoes, but I get it. But you see the $90 pair of shoes that your child's friend has, and you're afraid, well, if I don't get those, they're not going to think I love them. If I don't get those, they're not going to feel whatever at school. And now I'm willing to go into debt because of a fear of what might happen, rather than saying, this is what I can afford. I'm giving my child the best I can give them. They understand that. They know I love them, and this is what we're doing. Fear can push us into debt. Fear can push us into neglect. Fear can push us into a host of negative things for the family.
Yeah.
And then the same thing, our kids might, again, especially in those teenage years, they might be leaning towards friend groups, or they might be leaning towards questions, and we're afraid to answer their questions from the gospel because, well, I'm in conflict with culture. I'm in conflict with this teacher that they really respect, and I'm afraid if I say this, they're going to push me away as a parent. So now I'm no longer willing to bring truth to the conversation because I'm afraid my kid will cut me off for 3 days. And so I just don't. And then it gets, now they stay in that mindset, or they keep their mind in that content for longer. Now it's harder because now they're being very influenced by this idea or worldview that I have been afraid to speak against because I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be that parent. So yeah, I think fear is constantly being managed in our parenting.
Yeah, for sure. So I can completely relate to having a toddler and being confused about, oh my gosh, it's like you're absolutely insane right now.
Right.
But what do I do? Because absolutely, it's you don't want to. You don't want to go to one extreme, and so, but it sounds like that really it comes down to what you said as far as wisdom and like having wisdom, being aware, that things can get out of control, and being aware of the extremes, like the extreme of abandonment or the extreme of being over, just too much. But I love what you said, and I think that it is helpful, and really just to ask God where the line is, when have we gone too far in our discipline, or where have we been holding back because of fear? And that, I guess, is a Holy Spirit thing too.
It is, and I think sometimes even our kids will let us, when the Apostle Paul gives us that instruction not to provoke your children to wrath. There are times that a child is upset. That's not wrath. But when I understand, I've pushed too far, now I've driven my child not to a place of conviction, but a place of wrath, I've gone too far.
Yeah.
And, because those are different set points for each child. And I think that's why it's hard to say, here's the line. You find that line with each child.
Right.
Because we all respond differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And even as you were saying that, I think it also relates to our friendships as well, as far as being afraid to speak out about our faith concerning something because we don't want to hurt somebody or say something, when in reality that, we still have to be faithful to present the gospel to them, so that they know the truth, and the chances of them absolutely, especially someone that you've been close to for a long time, just like hating you and,
Yeah.
going into a total depression, the chances of that happening are probably less than what we picture in our minds.
Oh, sure. Yes.
And though they might disagree or be disappointed, we probably overemphasize the problem. I know I have
I
in
do,
my life as
for sure.
well, and there's been times where I thought, man, I wish I would have said something, but I didn't out of fear.
Yeah.
So that's good. I think it relates all the way across the board. Just lastly today, I'd love to dive deeper into this idea you talked about, discerning the mountain that's in front of us.
Yeah.
And how God rescues us,
Yep.
but sometimes he sustains us.
Yep.
And you brought up the teaching of Jesus in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20. He talked about a faith the size of a mustard seed that can move mountains.
Yep.
Yet sometimes God is calling us to go over a mountain
Yep.
or even around a mountain. And so you ask the question, is God speaking in this current situation to sustain us, or is he speaking to rescue us?
Yeah.
And now, I know you already unpacked that a lot in your message, but I was wondering if you could just go a little bit further, because I think as Christ followers, sometimes we get stuck on what God isn't doing in our lives.
Yeah.
We're waiting for him to either take something away or move something that we want moved. But yeah, sometimes we might just have a lack of discernment for what our next step is, and God's just waiting on us to make a move in the right direction. So how can we be better discerners of what God is speaking to the situations in our lives, whether it's a problem, whether it's our job, whether it's a decision we need to make, moving, whatever it would be, maybe we're waiting on God to do something, but he's not calling us to move the mountain, but rather go around it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess the core of that question is probably discernment in general. So let's kind of maybe start there and work our way to what I think you're asking. I think discernment has been very difficult for our generation, and by our generation, what I mean is people serving Jesus today, regardless of their age. In that we haven't been very good at following, period. So when we're talking about discernment, we're talking about following the will of God or following God's leading.
Right.
We don't follow any leading very well. And so as a result, we're actually not, it's not very natural to us to follow. So maybe let's look at it like this. They talk about people following peer groups well, but not maybe the teacher's suggestion. And there's a truth in that, and there's a necessity in that. But there's also the need to, if an instructor asks something, and again, we're assuming we're not talking about something that's going to hurt you, something that's against your values, just generally speaking, use black ink instead of blue ink. If someone who is in a position of authority asks us to do something, when we comply, we are submitting to that, or we're following that. In doing that with a parent, with a teacher, with a boss, with a law enforcement officer, like whoever would be in authority over us, as we become good at following on the earth, I actually think it positions us to follow heaven well. If we don't follow on the earth very well, we're not going to be very good at following heaven. And so, like when 1 John says that, how can you love God when you don't love the person right next to you? Well, how can we follow God, our ultimate authority, if we haven't followed simple authority on the earth that he's set and ordained over us? So I think it starts there. I think discernment starts in that place. Because if I've gotten good at following, in the process, I've actually taught myself how to discern the right direction. Because in following them, I learned, oh, this worked out better. I wanted to do it that way. They asked me to do it this way. In the end, this was better. So I'm learning to follow. I think the same is true of the gospel. We're wanting to discern a very spiritual, very qualitative path when we haven't followed the very quantitative gospel letter. So God says do this in the word. I'm not having to discern that. I don't need to pray to seek an answer. It's clear. He says, love your neighbor. Or he says, don't speak false words against your whatever. When I learn to do that, again, I'm now learning to discern. So I think what we lack today is we haven't trained ourselves to follow God through the word, Therefore, we really, when it comes to something spiritual to be discerned, we struggle. So now we're at, the word says, speak to this mountain, be removed, or the word says, go around this mountain. Like when we go back to the children of Israel, he didn't lead them the easiest way to the promised land, because he said, you're going to be met with war and you're not going to be able to fight those battles. So I'm going to lead you around the battle right now. So he did. He didn't lead them through the mountain. He led them around it. He led them through the Red Sea. There were things that they were able to go through, things they were able to go around that he didn't remove, that they just, they walked around stuff. Then if we use the Red Sea as an example, he removed it. They passed. He closed it up. That would be like moving the Red Sea. But how did they discern that? We had to walk that all the way back, literally to Moses being willing even to go to Pharaoh and speak words to Pharaoh. So that was a long process of Moses learning to follow God before he could discern the Red Sea was going to part, or discern that he needed to put a sword in Joshua's hand to go and fight against Amalek. So I think with us, it's the same way. We have these fun Bible stories that we learned in Sunday school that are always make it very easy for us, and especially in sort of our camp in terms of very faith-based evangelical people. We can emphasize the moments where God did the extraordinary, and we sort of minimize the moments where God asked us to do something that was difficult. And we, as a result, we don't even know that's an option. So my point is, I can't discern most of the time that God would ask me to walk around something, because all I'm spending my time on are the moments that he just removed the mountain. Right. But if I'm aware of and I follow the fullness of the gospel, I know removing the mountain is an option. I know going around the mountain is an option. Because I know it's A or B, I'm able to say in prayer, God, which one is it? And if there's not a clear answer, I just wait. Sometimes we don't need to ask the mountain to be moved. We don't need to go around it. It's just a waiting game. But I think that it begins with following the word itself. And discernment, honestly, it's a rabbit hole. We could be there all day, right? Because it's so personal. Right. Asking somebody, how do you follow God personally? Yeah. They might say, I pray for 3 hours in the dark and an answer just emerges. Right. Awesome. Other people, it's a bit like when God selected David and Jesse had to go through bringing his sons one at a time, and Samuel had to 1, 2, 3. It was very process driven. But until God spoke, he would not anoint that one. Now, for me personally, I function a lot that way. I like looking at every single option, and I sort of pray over every option. Here's the mountain moving option. Here's the walk around the building option. Here's the go over the mountain. Here are the 3 options. Yeah. God, which one is it? Yeah. And it's just like one will emerge eventually.
That makes so much sense, though, because kind of what I got from all that, which I don't know if this is right or not, but that if we just start practicing the Word of God, that we will get better at discernment.
Absolutely.
So it's, we're praying, Lord, where should I go out to eat today? When in reality, in that moment, maybe just pick up our Bible, open it up, read through the Word, and then let that determine what we do during the day. If the whatever it is, if we open up the Word and it's encouraging us to, take care of widows and orphans. Well, you know what? Yeah. Rather than stress out about what I'm supposed to do for my job today, I'm just going to practice the Word today. I'm going to go do it. And then as we practice the written Word, it kind of forms the word forms inside of us, and then we're able to have better discernment on maybe the more vague, unconventional, not clear things. Yeah. And because we've been practicing the Word and it's inside of us, then we have a better understanding on how to discern what mountain is in front of us. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense, because I think that, especially in charismatic backgrounds, like you were saying, we're always wanting to hear, that next step clear, which absolutely I know God speaks that and He's faithful. But in reality, we're sometimes not very good at just picking up what He's already given us, the Word of God, reading it faithfully
Yeah.
and then practicing what it says.
Yeah.
Loving our neighbor, loving our brother, loving forgiving.
Yeah.
And so so that does make a whole lot of sense that maybe we just start with where we're at, what we have, and
Yeah.
then the rest will come later.
Yeah.
But that's so good. I really think that's good. Anything else that you want to add to that or add today?
Yeah, like you sparked me there a little bit when you talk about widows and orphans. So just because we were talking a little bit about parenting, putting that in there. My kids are always they're very involved in stuff, athletics, art, stuff like that. And we have a command to care for widows and orphans. As a dad, not to get emotional, but as a dad, like being a dad is huge. And having a dad in my life was huge. And so I look for opportunities because the gospel commands it for me to essentially be a father to the fatherless in moments. And so when my kids are involved in something and they have a friend or there's a kid on that team that doesn't have a dad there because their dad's not involved or whatever, man, that is a gospel command to me to cheer that kid on, to tell that kid they're not my kid. It's just, I could just focus on mine and I do what I do as a parent to mine. But in that moment, I don't have to pray and say, God, what do you want me to do here? I know what to do. Right. There's a child on that field that doesn't have a dad. I have a God-given command. You go be a father to the fatherless. And I just let Jesus shine in those spaces. And then I have found that just walking on the sidewalk in life, there will sometimes be a spark towards somebody. How did that happen spontaneously? Because in the moments that were obvious, I allowed God to use me. And so I think it's that simple. I really do. I think we've made it more complicated than it is.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for listening today. Once again, and thank you, Pastor Shawn.
Right on.
But that was our goal again for this conversation is to hopefully start more conversations. Talk about these things in your small groups. Talk about it with your friends, at home with your family. Ask some of these questions. And we are going to have some leader guides, some conversation guides up soon to kind of go along with these conversations that can help walk you through some of the things that we're talking about with scriptures. But again, we just want to become better disciples of Jesus, and sometimes that's very practical. And so to listen to Pastor Shawn's whole message from Sundays, you can actually visit our website, fwclakeland.org, subscribe to our YouTube channel, FWC Lakeland, or follow us on any of our social media pages. And we look forward to seeing you soon, and we'll see you next time.